At 2 minutes before 10 in the morning on June 19, 1944, the air search radar aboard the fast carrier USS Lexington began resolving a set of contacts to the southwest at approximately 150 miles. They were organized, dozens of blips folded together in a formation pattern, moving at aircraft speed on a heading that pointed directly at Task Force 58. In the Combat Information Center below the island structure, the fighter direction watch reached for his handset before the plot was finished updating. What was coming across that 150 miles of ocean was the full commitment of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. More than 400 aircraft drawn from 9 carriers, organized into 5-strike waves, built around a doctrine that Japanese carrier aviation had maintained since 1940. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. Ozawa had positioned his force approximately 350 miles from the nearest American task group, deliberately beyond the range of American carrier aircraft while remaining within the operational reach of his own. His pilots would fly out, strike, and recover at airfields on Guam on the return leg. The fulcrum of the entire plan was a specific technical reality. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had a combat radius that no American carrier fighter could match. That range advantage was not incidental to Japanese naval aviation doctrine. It was the doctrine, and it rested in June of 1944 as it had rested since the Zero entered fleet service in 1940, on choices that a Mitsubishi engineer named Jiro Horikoshi had made in Nagoya between 1937 and 1940. Horikoshi had been given requirements that, as he later described in a memoir written after the war, could not be satisfied within the materials and power plants available to Japan unless he followed a single principle to its terminus. Weight was the enemy of performance, and every gram removed from the airframe was performance added. He knew what the calculation cost. The armor plate behind the pilot, present in every European and American fighter of the period as a baseline requirement, was removed. The self-sealing compound inside the fuel tank walls, which prevented a punctured cell from igniting, was eliminated. The airframe was built of a new high-strength aluminum alloy machined to minimum viable tolerances because standard alloys were too heavy for the margins he required. The result weighed approximately 5,300 pounds in combat configuration. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, its principal American opponent in the first year of the Pacific War, weighed approximately 7,400. The weight difference was the performance difference. In sustained turning combat at low to medium altitude and moderate airspeed, the standard geometry of carrier fighter engagements as Japanese doctrine conceived them, the Zero had no equal in 1940 or 1941. Its turn radius was narrower than any contemporary Allied fighter. Its initial climb rate through the lower altitudes was superior. Its combat range with the standard drop tank exceeded 1,500 miles. In Chinese service from August of 1940, flying against Soviet-supplied fighters with experienced Soviet volunteer pilots, the aircraft accumulated a combat record in its first year that American and British analysts reviewing the intelligence found difficult to accept as genuine. What reinforced the record was the quality of the men flying it. Japanese naval aviation pilots of the pre-war years were drawn from a selection process that eliminated most candidates before they reached the flight line, then trained for 2 to 3 years before their first operational assignment. By Pearl Harbor, the men launching from Japanese carrier decks had accumulated flight hours and combat experience that the American training pipeline was not yet producing a volume. In the Philippines campaign of December 1941 and January 1942, Zero pilot from both carrier and land bases flew missions that American pre-war planning documents had assessed as technically impossible for single-engine carrier fighters. They intercepted Army B-17s at altitudes the planning files listed as beyond zero ceiling. They ranged over invasion beaches at combat radii that American intelligence had underestimated by a factor of 2. The reports that reached Washington in the first weeks of the war described an aircraft that could operate wherever it chose over contested airspace, and American units equipped with P-40s and Wildcats could not reliably prevent it from doing so. Against the Wildcat specifically, The encounter rate from Pearl Harbor through Guadalcanal established an exchange that was survivable but not sufficient. Over the full Guadalcanal campaign, from August of 1942 through February of 1943, the exchange settled at roughly 1.5 Wildcats lost for every 0 brought down. The Navy was absorbing the attrition. It was not absorbing it comfortably. And what was being exchanged on the Japanese side was something that could not be replaced on the same schedule. The pilots going down over Guadalcanal had trained for 3 years and fought for 2. Their successors were entering the operational pipeline with fewer hours, because the training program could not hold its pre-war standards while also filling the gaps that the campaign was opening. The Japanese Navy's carrier pilot selection and training system had been, before the war, among the most rigorous in any air force on Earth. The filtering process was designed to produce a small number of exceptional aviators rather than a large number of capable ones. That system worked until it met sustained attrition at a rate it had not been designed to survive. Midway in June of 1942 killed approximately 100 carrier aviators in 4 days. Not just aircraft, but the irreplaceable accumulation of their hours and judgment. The battles in the Solomons through the rest of 1942 and into 1943 continued the attrition. The men replacing them came off pipelines that command decisions had shortened to meet operational demand. By late 1943, the carrier air groups were being filled by pilots with flight experience that their aircraft's demanding performance characteristics had not been designed for. None of this was apparent to an outside observer looking at the Zero. The aircraft itself remained formidable. The question of whether the men available to fly it could still exploit what the aircraft offered was a different question, and it was one the Japanese Naval Command was managing with less transparency than the situation required. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch of Fighting 3 had been studying the Zero's performance data since early 1941, when the intelligence assessments on the aircraft first reached squadron level. Thatch was analytical by habit. His reading of the intelligence reports led him to a conclusion he stated plainly in later interviews. The Wildcat could not defeat the Zero in a turning fight, and no increment of pilot skill would close that gap at the aircraft level. His answer was a paired defensive weave in which 2 fighters in loose line abreast covered each other, so that a Zero settling on one pilot's tail was forced either to break off its attack or to cross into the wingman's gun sight. The maneuver worked. It reduced attrition in the Wildcat force to levels the Navy could manage. Thatch was the first to say that surviving an engagement was not the same as winning it. The Navy needed an aircraft that could win. The Bureau of Aeronautics requirement for a new carrier fighter had been issued in June of 1941, 6 months before the country entered the war. The specification listed its requirements as requirements, not trade-offs. 6 50 caliber machine guns, armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks. Whatever these items added in weight, the aircraft would carry. The power plant would be chosen to move that weight at the required speed. The specified engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder 2-row radial, then producing approximately 2,000 horsepower in production variants and already under development for other programs, including the Vought F-4U Corsair. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, received the contract. The company had been building carrier fighters for the Navy since 1931. Their previous aircraft, the F-3F biplane and the F-4F Wildcat, had been solid and functional rather than exceptional, designs that held up under carrier operations reliably and that were understood by the pilots who flew them. The new aircraft, designated XF-6F, was a different undertaking in scale. The R-2800 required a fuselage and cowling substantially larger than anything Grumman had previously built. 6 guns required wing volume and ammunition storage. The armor and self-sealing requirements added weight that no amount of design elegance could eliminate. Bill Schwindler's team at Bethpage accepted these as the boundaries they were designing within and built the aircraft outward from them. The XF-6F-1 flew for the first time on June 26, 1942, 18 months after the original specification. Between that first flight and the delivery of production aircraft to fleet squadrons, 14 months. The F-6F-3 entering fleet service in early 1943 weighed approximately 12,700 pounds in combat configuration. The pilot sat behind 3/8 of an inch of steel armor at the head position and 1 inch at the seat. The windscreen was built to stop rifle-caliber rounds. The fuel system self-sealed against 50 caliber hits. 6 M2 Browning machine guns, 3 per wing, fired at a combined rate that delivered approximately 300 rounds every 2 seconds in sustained fire. At convergence range, the beaten zone from all 6 guns together was roughly 6 feet across. Not a stream of fire, but a field of it. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 produced maximum speed of approximately 376 miles per hour at 23,000 feet, more than 40 miles per hour faster than the Zero at altitude. Rate of climb was approximately 3,500 feet per minute. And in a dive, the characteristic the formal test program had identified as decisive, the Hellcat's structural margins permitted speeds at which the Zero's controls stiffened and became progressively unresponsive. That characteristic had been documented on July 10, 1942, when a Navy salvage team found a Mitsubishi A6M20 Model 21 inverted in the tundra on a Kutan island in the Aleutians. The aircraft had belonged to Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga of the Ryujo Air Group. Koga had force-landed on June 4th during a strike on Dutch Harbor after his aircraft was hit by ground fire. He had selected a Kutan because the terrain appeared flat from altitude. It was soft tundra, and the Zero nosed over on landing contact, inverting the aircraft. Koga, held by his harness, did not survive. The Zero itself was substantially intact. The Navy shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island at San Diego, and then to the Naval Air Station at Anacostia in Washington. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders flew it through a systematic evaluation program across varying airspeeds and altitudes. His formal report documented the Zero's exceptional turn performance at low to moderate speeds and added a specific measurement the combat record had only suggested. Above approximately 230 knots indicated airspeed. Aileron resistance increased with velocity. Above 270 knots, rolling the aircraft quickly required physical effort that demonstrably lengthened pilot reaction time. At 300 knots and above in a sustained dive, maneuvering was functionally limited in a way that the Hellcat, built to carry structural load at high speed, was not. Sanders' report went to the Bureau of Aeronautics and the Fleet Training Commands. It confirmed the design premise Grumman had been working from, and it gave the tactical doctrine precise grounding. Do not fight the Zero in a turning engagement at low altitude if any alternative exists. Use the power advantage to control the altitude. Use the dive speed to control when to engage and when to brake. Use the 6 guns. Except the hits the Hellcat is built to absorb and the Zero is not. The American training pipeline, in the period from mid-1942 onward, was moving in a direction the Japanese pipeline was not. A Hellcat pilot entering fleet service in 1943 had typically completed 300 to 400 hours before his first combat assignment, including dedicated time against tactics derived from the Zero's known characteristics. The Navy's training doctrine was specific about what engagement geometry to refuse and why. The gap in pilot quality that had existed in December of 1941 was narrowing. In some squadrons by late 1943, it had already closed. More than 12,000 Hellcats came off the Grumman line and from the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors between early 1943 and the end of the war. The first entered combat in late August of 1943 during strikes against Marcus Island. The encounters were brief. Japanese pilots who flew those missions and returned noted something about the new American fighter they had not written about the Wildcat or the P-40 or anything else they had previously faced. Over the following 22 months, every Japanese aviator who engaged the Hellcat and survived to describe the experience said essentially the same thing. That account, and what it revealed about the doctrine that had carried Japanese carrier aviation from Pearl Harbor to the Marianas, is the rest of this story. The Japanese pilots who launched from Ozawa's carriers on the morning of June 19th 1944, knew the battle would be decisive. The phrase decisive battle, Kessen, was not rhetorical in Japanese naval doctrine. It described a specific operational concept, a single fleet engagement in which superior fighting quality would resolve the strategic balance. The concept had been developed in the interwar years by planners who assumed Japanese carriers, with their longer-ranged aircraft and their elite air crews, would approach such a battle with permanent advantages. By June of 1944, one of those advantages was intact. One was not. The aircraft were the A6M-5 Model 52, an upgraded Zero variant with a maximum speed of approximately 350 miles per hour at altitude, an improvement on the earlier production versions that Japanese fleet planners had noted with some satisfaction. The pilots flying it had trained on a pipeline that the accumulated attrition of the Solomons campaign of Midway of 2 years of sustained combat had shortened well below its pre-war standards. Ozawa noted the training disparity in internal communications before the battle. He acknowledged to American interrogators after the war that his air groups had not been ready for the engagement the strategic situation required him to conduct. He flew anyway, because the American advance toward the Marianas could not be permitted to continue, and the forces available were the forces he had. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The force he was moving toward was not, in June of 1944, the force that had struggled to hold Guadalcanal 2 years earlier. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher comprised 15 carriers organized into 4 task groups, with approximately 550 Hellcats among roughly 900 embarked aircraft. The fighter direction system that coordinated its defense had been tested and refined through 2 years of Pacific operations. Radar coverage deep and overlapping, fighter direction officers able to vector intercept from contacts at distances that gave Hellcat squadrons time to climb to altitude and position before engagement. The system had been exercised at Truk, at Saipan, at Guam, and it worked with the precision that comes from execution under real conditions. At 09:57 on June 19th, the radar plot confirmed the first Japanese wave inbound at approximately 150 miles. The fighter direction officer calculated bearings and altitudes. 450 Hellcats were already climbing. By the time the first Japanese formation reached the outer picket screen, the intercept had been organized for 43 minutes. Hellcats above and ahead, with the altitude advantage that American radar had purchased them at the cost of nothing more than time. What happened to the first wave exists in American after-action reports and in the accounts of the Japanese pilots who returned from it. The formation flew into descending attacks from aircraft positioned above and to the sun's side, diving through the Japanese ranks at speeds the Zero pilots could not match in recovery. 6-gun fire disrupted the formation's geometry from the first contact. A coordinated carrier strike required its components to arrive over the target together, within a timing window narrow enough to overwhelm the combat air patrol. The first wave did not arrive together, because the Hellcats were inside the formation before it had covered half the distance to the carriers. Of the more than 60 aircraft in the first wave, the majority were down short of the fleet. Those that reached the task force arrived in scattered sections rather than as a coordinated strike and were handled by anti-aircraft fire before they could press organized attacks. No American ship was hit. The second wave launched 128 aircraft. It was also detected at range. The fighter direction teams had the second intercept position before the first wave's engagement had resolved. The second wave met the same conditions over the same water. Hellcats above, diving, firing, climbing away before the Zero pilots could fully respond. Pilots who had been trained to fight the turning engagement the Zero required had no way to convert the situation they were in into the situation their doctrine demanded. The Hellcat was not below them. It was not beside them. It descended from altitude in diving passes that lasted seconds and departed back into the climb before the engagement could become a maneuvering fight. The third and fourth waves, launched through the early afternoon, met the same outcome. The third wave, partially diverted toward the Guam airfields, found Hellcats waiting over the island as well. The fighter direction teams had anticipated the diversion and positioned aircraft accordingly. The airfield perimeter at Guam acquired a border of wrecked Japanese aircraft through the afternoon, while the air battle was consuming Ozawa's striking force above the surface. The submarines were working below it. At 8 minutes after 8 in the morning, USS Albacore put a torpedo into the fleet carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, the largest and newest carrier in the Japanese fleet, commissioned 3 months before the battle. The damage to the aviation fuel system below decks was not immediately fatal. The decision that made it fatal came from damage control. Ventilation fans were opened throughout the ship's interior in an attempt to clear fuel vapor. The fans spread the vapor instead of clearing it, distributing it through the Taiho's internal spaces. At 3:32 in the afternoon, accumulated vapor ignited. The explosion was catastrophic and rapid. Ozawa was transferred by boat to a cruiser, carrying the mobile fleet's signal flags because they had not had time to move the fleet radio equipment. Shortly after the Taiho was hit, USS Kavala found the fleet carrier Shokaku, one of the carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike in December of 1941, and put 3 torpedoes into her. The Shokaku, on fire and down by the bow, sank at approximately 3 in the afternoon of June 19th. By evening, Ozawa had lost 2 fleet carriers to submarines and had expended, in 5 waves of attack against Task Force 58, more than 300 aircraft. American combat air patrol losses on June 19th were approximately 29 aircraft. The following day, American aircraft found the remnants of the mobile fleet at the outer edge of their strike range. Mitcher launched anyway, in the late afternoon, knowing the return would arrive after dark and that fuel margins would be critical. The strike sank the carrier Hyo and damaged others. More than 80 American aircraft ran out of fuel in the darkness on the return flight. Mitcher's response to this was to order every ship in the task force to illuminate. Running lights, flight deck lights, searchlights pointed straight up into the sky, exposing the entire force to any Japanese submarine in the area in order to guide his pilots home. He later indicated that he judged the risk from submarines the correct risk to accept. Most of the pilots who went into the water that night were recovered. The battle was over. Its accounting was not in dispute. Ozawa had committed the available strength of Japanese carrier aviation to the engagement his doctrine had described as decisive. He had lost more than 400 aircraft over 2 days, 2 fleet carriers, and the operational coherence of his remaining air groups. He told American interrogators after the war that the situation had been clear to him before the battle began. His pilots lacked the training and hours that the engagement would require. He had flown anyway because the strategic situation gave him no choice about whether to fight, only about where. The accounts that Japanese pilots gave of what they had encountered in the air above the Philippine Sea, in debriefs, in interrogations, in the post-war memoirs that survivors eventually published, are the historical record that the script's question promises to examine. They are consistent across sources of different types from men of different ranks at different points in the war. That consistency is itself part of what the record shows. The pilots who described the Hellcat were not uninformed observers making impressionistic assessments under stress. They were the surviving members of a naval aviation force that had been flying combat since China in 1940. Men who had measured themselves against British Spitfires in the Indian Ocean, against P-40s and Buffaloes in the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, against Wildcats across the Solomons for a year and a half. They understood aircraft performance as a practical question answered in the air, not in specifications. Their testimony on the Hellcat had the quality of professional judgment accumulated through contact. The first observation, appearing consistently across accounts, was about firepower. The Zero's standard armament, 2 20mm cannon in the wings and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns in the cowling, was formidable against aircraft whose fuel systems and structures were not protected against it. Against earlier American carrier fighters, the cannon had been sufficient to achieve reliable kills from short burst fire. Against the Hellcat, pilots reported that burst fire from their cannon produced hits that the aircraft absorbed without the outcomes those hits had reliably produced before. The armor plate behind the Hellcat's pilot stopped rounds that would have been fatal in any unprotected cockpit. The self-sealing fuel cells absorbed punctures that would have ignited a Zero's tanks from the same ammunition. And the 650 caliber guns the Hellcat carried produced a weight of return fire that was different in kind from anything the Zero's pilots had faced from previous American fighters. A field of rounds, not a stream, that arrived in volumes that overwhelmed the defensive maneuvering that Zero pilots used to reduce their exposure to hostile fire. The second consistent observation was about engagement geometry. The Hellcat refused to fight on the terms the Zero required. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined from the lessons of China and the opening months of the Pacific War, was built on the turning fight, the sustained inside radius maneuver at moderate altitude and low to moderate airspeed, in which the Zero's agility was most decisive. American pilots by 1943 had been taught explicitly to deny this geometry. They used altitude, dive speed, and the controlled approach from above that Sanders' Akutan Zero Test report had described and that fleet training had translated into mandatory doctrine. When a Zero attempted to follow a Hellcat into a dive to maintain the engagement, the speed differential worked against it, controls stiffening, aileron response degrading, the pilot unable to maneuver at the rates the Hellcat retained. When a Zero attempted to pull into a climb to meet a diving Hellcat, it slowed into a position that the Hellcat's 6 guns could address. The tactical situation the Zero's design had been optimized to create, the patient, slow, inside turn, was a situation American pilots had been specifically trained, in aircraft specifically built, to prevent. The third observation is the one that appears most uniformly across the widest range of sources, from formal interrogation records to published memoirs, and it is the one that most directly describes what had changed between the war the Zero was designed to fight and the war it was fighting by 1943 and 1944. Japanese naval air pilots described the Hellcat using language that translates, across various phrasings, to the same meaning: it will not burn. The Zero's most reliable killing method against American aircraft in the first 2 years of the war had been incendiary fire from its 20mm cannon into unprotected fuel systems. American pilots had learned to fear this. A short burst into a Wildcat's unprotected fuel cells was often sufficient to start a fire that ended the engagement. When Hellcat pilots returned from contact with Zero cannon fire and the aircraft's fuel system had not ignited, the failure of the expected outcome was the clearest possible signal that the fight had changed. Masatake Kiyomiya, who served as a Japanese Naval Air Staff officer through the Pacific War and co-authored a post-war account with Zero designer Jiro Horikoshi, described the point at which accumulated combat reports made the situation unmistakable. The aircraft the Japanese Navy was encountering had been built to survive specifically what the Zero had previously used to destroy its opponents. The fuel that should have burned did not burn. The pilot who should have been dead was still flying. The engagement that should have ended in the Zero's favor continued until the Hellcat chose to break away. Horikoshi's own accounting of what the war revealed about his design is among the most direct in the post-war literature. He had known the trade he was making when he removed the armor and the fuel protection. He had calculated that the performance gained was worth the vulnerability accepted. The Hellcat's record, and the Hellcat's specific, documented resistance to the cannon fire that had made the Zero lethal, was the evidence that the calculation had not been correct. He wrote about this in terms that were neither self-exculpatory nor falsely modest. The Zero had performed exactly as he had designed it to perform. The war had resolved the trade against him. The Japanese Naval Command's management of the Marianas battle's outcome was careful. The public received accounts of a major fleet engagement without the specific figures that would have made the scale of the loss unmistakable. The internal assessments were more candid. The Naval General Staff's analysis in the weeks following June 19th acknowledged that the mobile carrier force could no longer be expected to achieve the exchange rates against American fighters that would allow sustained conventional carrier operations. The conclusion was not that better aircraft were needed, though work on replacement designs had been underway for 2 years. The conclusion was that the time required to produce sufficient numbers of better aircraft and sufficient numbers of pilots trained to fly them was time that the strategic situation would not permit. The formal operational answer to this conclusion arrived in October of 1944. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi reached Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines on October 19th and addressed the pilots of the 201st Air Group. The exchange rate arithmetic of conventional carrier attack aviation was no longer viable, he told them. The only method available for guaranteeing damage to an American carrier was a single-use aircraft carrying a bomb, guided by a pilot who would not return. He asked for volunteers. The Special Attack Program was not, as it is sometimes characterized, an act of cultural fatalism disconnected from operational logic. It was an engineering answer to a tactical accounting problem. Conventional Japanese carrier attack aircraft could no longer achieve hit rates sufficient to justify the exchange against American combat air patrol. A pilot who did not need to survive the Hellcat's fire to complete his mission was not subject to the exchange rate calculus that had made conventional attack aviation unviable. The kamikaze program was the direct institutional acknowledgement that the F-6F had done what it was designed to do. From Pearl Harbor to the Marianas, Japanese carrier aviation had operated as the dominant force in Pacific naval combat. After June 19th, it operated on different terms, and eventually on no terms at all. The Hellcat's final accounting from the war is among the more specific in the statistical record of the Pacific. More than 12,000 were produced during the conflict. The aircraft was credited with approximately 5,160 aerial combat kills, more than any other Allied fighter in the Pacific theater. Against those kills, approximately 270 Hellcats were lost in air combat. The overall exchange ratio was approximately 19-1 in the Hellcat's favor across all operations from late 1943 to the end of the war. Ozawa survived. He gave his interrogations with the directness of a man who had nothing left to conceal. He described the training gap between his pilots and the Americans in terms that confirmed what the combat record had already established. He did not, in those interrogations, say anything about the Hellcat that his pilots had not already said in the air. They had said it on June 19th, in the seconds between the radar contact at 150 miles and whatever happened when the Hellcats arrived from altitude. They said it in debriefs and action reports through the rest of 1943 and all of 1944. They said it in memoirs written a decade after the war by men who had spent the intervening years trying to describe, accurately, what the experience of encountering that aircraft had been. What they said was this: it does not fight the way we were prepared for. It will not accept the engagement on the terms our aircraft and our training required. And when we hit it with what had always been sufficient, it did not behave the way anything we had previously flown against was built to behave. It will not burn. That was the answer to the question the Zero's design had posed. Horikoshi had built an aircraft that bet on the fire starting. Grumman built one that bet on the fire not starting and put 6 guns on it to resolve any argument about whose bet was correct. At 2 minutes before 10 on June 19th, 1944, the blip at 150 miles on the Lexington's radar represented 400 Japanese pilots flying toward a doctrine that had governed their Air Force since 1940. The aircraft climbing toward them had been designed, specification by specification, armor plate by armor plate, to be the answer to that doctrine. Every pilot who flew into it and came home afterwards said, in their own language and their own terms, that it was. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.